Right, thanks to our speakers. And now time for some Q&A, and feel free to email them through. I can monitor the email as we go, or we do have a roving mic if you'd like to ask your question in person. So I'm just going to start off with a question for each of our speakers to kick us off. Kirsten, to you first, where do you see the opportunities to harness disruptive change to enhance the customer experience, and will that translate into improving, do you think, the industry's reputation?
I see a significant opportunity. It's very related to trust and trust deficits. A complex product, difficult to understand as an industry. I'm not sure, if I think about my experience of working in insurance over the last 10 years, I'm not sure that we've made all that much effort to make it easy to understand. I can remember a few key conversations in a former company I worked for, not where I work for now, I must say, where there was a fair bit of energy around making sure that customers couldn't understand insurance products, and that would be something we would want to maintain. So I think if you look at the International Trust Index, insurance is still sitting in the bottom right-hand corner together with used car salesmen and stockbrokers, which is not a great place to be, especially if what you actually provide is resilience, and if your whole service depends upon an asymmetry of trust, where we expect our customers to trust in a premium for a service they may never need. So for me, there are many things that a changing world will enable us to do better for customers. Essential for me is a sense of trust and transparency around the risk being borne, co-creation in terms of the possibility of consumers, communities, small businesses, large corporates determining together with their insurer what risk each wants to bear and why, and ultimately resilience.
Yes, we had a former chief executive of Telecom who made herself very famous by talking about the idea of making complexity present for customers. Where's that going to be driven from, do you think? What level within the organisation?
From my perspective, responding to the need to evolve yourself needs to come from every level of the organisation. Yes, you absolutely require the board and the executive to understand why that's necessary and to create the space for that possibility. But the people who are handling our contact centres are significantly better informed than most people within the organisation of how actual needs are evolving. If I think about our town halls, I've heard over and over, had conversations with people coming up to me and saying, I've got customers who are using GoPro cameras on their cars to capture the guy in front of them. Do we have a way of thinking about that can we recognise that? So that constant sort of two-way flow of information across the whole organisation, for me, is where it needs to come from.
And that's really interesting, because obviously there's sort of empowerment issues and everything around that, but how have you thought about how that connects from that level of the organisation to those that are formulating products and making those sort of decisions? How have you created that communication channel to occur?
We do it through, we were doing it through a secondment model. We've suspended that for the time being, but we'll likely go back to it. So what we have been doing, and it's tested very well, is to make sure that we bring into this work, we literally create teams who are putting their hands on the experience of actively working with disruptive change in the field, very mixed teams, all levels of the organisation. And for a long enough time, secondment we ran for 12 months full time, so that people had long enough to get used to being uncomfortable, used to doing something with that, and used to thinking about how to thrive within that context, and making sure that it's connecting very broad and very deep. So it's partly about getting people to actually do the work, and partly about making sure that you really leverage a diversity of perspectives across the whole organisation. That's
great. Can I get the AV guys just to put up the email address on the screen, please? Just for those that do want to email a question through, it's icnzqa@gmail.com. George, you talked a lot about, obviously, areas around disruption and opportunities. Where do you see the biggest opportunities existing for underwriters in this world of disruption?
I think having a look at that chart of 53 risks that were identified by risk managers and starting to think about how we go about bridging those gaps is the broad-based opportunity. But I think definitely in the short term is moving as an industry from enthusiastic amateurs, I would say, and don't be insulted when I say that, in cyber, but actually truly understanding the risk. And to give you an example, Aon is just one example, but we've actually acquired a firm called Stross Friedberg, which works in cyber risk management, which will help us better understand the original risk. So they're doing cyber testing of organisations. They will rate an organisation on their cyber resilience. They will help us understand the product, the risk better, so that we can actually then inform the industry on product development. So right through that value chain of original product, insurance company, and then also us as reinsurance brokers bring in the capacity to support insurers in underwriting that risk, because the opportunity is vast. I reckon some would say there's an analogue to underwriting property cat and how models have facilitated us and become a currency for transferring risk in the property catastrophe space. But we do need to recognise as well that property cat is a natural process. When we're looking at cyber, it's a social science process. So there is different considerations in understanding the risk and the volatility around that risk. But I think definitely an opportunity, in the next few years, I'm sure the analytics teams will be spending almost, if not more, time modelling cyber than property cat. So I think it'll be quite interesting.
And just picking up on the presentation that Scott just gave us, given the counter currents between motor and product liability insurance, what do you see will be the impact on motor insurance, GWP, the largest single line written by general insurers in New Zealand?
Yeah. So some of the numbers that I quoted earlier were based on some high-level assumptions that we did, and it was something like, let's look at historically the adoption of motor vehicles and other technologies and how that has accelerated over time. Let's extrapolate that, not necessarily linearly, but to look at the potential adoption of autonomous vehicles. And it's not just motor vehicles, it's shipping, aircraft, drones, etc., that whole space. And then let's think about how the insurance premium makeup will change necessarily from damage to liability. And just utilising those assumptions and recognising that there will be a drop in damage but an increase potentially in liability. That was the number I quoted earlier about a 40% reduction in motor premium by 2050. That's a long way out, and I recognise that. So we'll see how that pans out.
And that broadly lines up with that KPMG study I quoted in the opening as well too. Yeah. So you're in alignment between the two parties there. Scott, you've essentially in your presentation disrupted the current popular view of the future with insurance being just one part of a car as a service model. Doesn't this potentially ignore serious disruption to the insurance sector, do you think?
Yeah, my view could be taken as railing at the moon, declaring it's never going to affect me. As a lifelong holder of minority opinions, I don't necessarily say tomorrow all insurance will disappear and we'll be in trouble. I do agree that a future possible model is this car as a service. You'll simply buy time, the car will come to you, it'll have insurance covered by the manufacturer, sort of a super Uber model. But what's curious is this transition period, and you can put it into 5 years and 25-year sort of blocks. Boston Consulting did a survey, I think a year or two ago. Now they surveyed about 5,000 or 6,000 people through various countries in Europe and through Asia. And what they found, 60% of the respondents said they were likely or very likely to want to try and drive an autonomous vehicle. Now that's a compelling statistic. Underneath that, when they got to the why would you be likely, the overwhelming response was because it'd be really convenient not to have to park my car. I just want the parking facility. The second bit was they said, some convenience where I could work or do other things while I'm driving. But none of them said, because I don't want to drive anymore. And in fact, less than half said they felt comfortable being in a car where they had no control at all. So I think we still have to go through a period of acceptance where we as humans move to ultimately handing over full responsibility.
And how do you believe, How do you believe that insurers should prepare for the post-autonomous vehicle world?
Okay. All right, so I think three things. One, don't panic. You've got a much longer time frame than you possibly think. Two, I would get busy with product development. If you don't have some of the products that I mentioned, and there will be others that I have overlooked, by the way, if you don't have those in your skill set now, partner with organisations that can help you build those products. So cyber is, I guess, the one we'll all start with today. You'll probably want to partner with a global firm who's doing this elsewhere and getting to understand some of the environments outside of New Zealand that does have expertise and is working indeed with some of the manufacturers. So that's product development number two. Number three, with my consulting hat on, says this: if you think your profitability is contingent upon your business mix remaining stable, I would take a good look at to what degree your expense allocation and capital allocation is cross-subsidising certain lines of business. Over time, we often see that certain classes that are more profitable are inadvertently allocated greater overheads. If that's the case, I'd be wary, because motor will start to drop away. And then you as an organisation need to ask yourself, to what degree is my organisation, also known as my executive structure, reliant upon a nice big premium pool to keep us all here? Some honest mirror gazing is going to have to take place.
Great, thanks for that. All right, let's take some questions from the email. Kirsten, for you, what do you consider are the top three mindset characteristics that a firm pushing a strategic innovation agenda ought to be looking for when bringing new people into their business?
Okay, systems thinking. So the ability of people to see relationships, not nodes, and to think in terms of complexity. If I don't know whether any of you know the David Snowden's Cynefin framework, it's worth looking at the difference between obvious, complicated, complex, and chaotic. Complexity requires a very, very different set of practices and habits and mindsets. That'd be number one. And it is really about relationships, and the only way you really deal with complexity effectively is by ingesting it. You can't shove it back into a complicated box. Second would be a growth mindset that you alluded to, Carol Dweck's work. That's really about a fundamental difference in people believing that it's possible to learn and change, and believing it to the point of not even asking themselves whether that's a thing they can do, but just using every single iota of experience to adapt and change and learn. So failure is just not a category. It's simply, there are degrees of learning, and there's valuable learning, constructive, helpful learning, and not particularly helpful learning. So that ability to self-transform. And the third I would describe as the abundance mindset. I think there's some brilliant research that I've just recently come across around looking at testing people in the difference between what's called a scarcity mindset and an abundance mindset. Most large organisations that I have been part of are pretty dominated by a scarcity mindset, and our language is all around resources are finite, capital is finite, time is finite, we need to make trade-offs. Good managers are people who know how to make choices. Those choices are tough. There's a hero journey around people who make tough choices in a world of scarcity. It's a mindset. We simply don't live in a world of scarcity. We live in a world of abundance, extraordinary abundance. And a lot of the testing that's been going on has been finding that people thinking with a scarcity mindset and people thinking with an abundance mindset, you can change that. You can change what you see. And when you shift from abundance to scarcity, human IQ goes down by 10%, which is fascinating, because that tells me a hell of a lot about how we create self-affirming loops for what's true and unquestionable, as opposed to literally change the frame and ask a different set of questions.
So what's interesting about the mindset area, and of course it's being pushed a lot in schools now, of course the idea that if you can teach it early becomes a lot more valuable, but what's your experience about being able, you know, particularly with people at a mid-level or mid-age career point, being able to embrace those true mindset characteristics?
So I use very deliberately experience. So kind of the adult learning cycle around, you need to experience stuff visually to be able to really deal with it. So I was thinking about what you were saying about automated vehicles. I absolutely agree with what Scott's describing with the question of automation. I think it's way more complex than anybody is assuming, and I'm fascinated by our determination to play out linear trajectories. But the ways in which it is likely to play out are complex, and they require experiencing. So experiencing what it's like to have mobility as a service, experiencing transition to automation, those kinds of practical experience, that's the point of experimentation in the way in which we're trying to do it. Get people's hands dirty, have them sit in a room with a guy who's just made a decision in the Australian federal and state government to make 2030 the year by which we mandate no human being driving on the road. Experience how that conversation is played out and start thinking about what's driving that. Start listening to what's sitting behind that conversation, and what's fascinating in that conversation is the concern around baby boomers and the fact that you've got a huge ageing population who are going to be unable to drive, and they've got money and they don't want to be stuck at home. So there's some interesting, unusual things. Experiencing that, kind of reflecting on that, turning that into some kind of pattern thinking, and then trying it again and taking a completely different perspective and listening to people saying there's no way I'm never going to drive a car. All of that sort of stuff is actually what helps adults get their heads around it. But it does require you to really actively create options for yourself that give you that first-hand experience.
Kirsten, thanks for that. Question for you, George and Scott. Would a driverless car IT system hack across a fleet of vehicles that all have accidents as a result of that system hack be an event? Good question.
Yes. And that's something we've thought about, and looking at how we transition that risk again from damage to liability, but also thinking about new catastrophe scenarios or disaster scenarios, and cyber actually cutting across all classes of business, for example. And we have to start thinking about clash instead of thinking of product in silos, property, marine, etc. We're going to have to be thinking horizontally rather than vertically now, because of the potential scenarios and the clash that can come out of it. So it is a difficult one, and it's going to present, extremely complex modelling challenges. And, I guess the one thing we haven't talked about today is how, well, you have touched on it, sorry, is mindset, is how the talent and how the industry will have to retool to actually think a little differently about the risk and think about multi-class risk and scenarios, etc., and bring that into our thinking, because it will become much more social science.
That's a good point, isn't it? Because we're moving from this idea of almost predictable risk to lots of unknown risks.
Yeah, and all these factors combined. I mean, at one end of the spectrum, we've talked about big data and the abundance of data, and actually being very granular in how we rate a risk. But actually, fundamentally, that is against the concept of insurance, of insurance pooling. If you can rate a risk and reduce the uncertainty, then we start actually classifying people into insurable, non-insurable, or risks, and actually the insurance concept breaks down. So it is fascinating, the whole area, and I think this is where it does require a bit of external thinking for the industry to think about the potential scenarios, or more multi-dimensionally, I think you've called them futures, but I think that's right. We've got to think about the potential ways the industry can evolve.
Scott?
Just at a slightly different dimension, rather than a big E-event, there is very soon going to be the potential for what I would call a little E-event. They're already trialling what's called platooning. So these are, I've got a vehicle and I find there's another vehicle in front of me that can talk to each other, and I'll just go, you know what, you can drive. This one in front is being driven by a human, but I hand over control and follow it. My car can link, and that can happen X numbers of cars behind. And the UK are talking about this openly in these discussion papers and in considering regulation and putting it on British roads. So you don't need a hack across millions of vehicles. You could have a hack across the lead vehicle that may well have 15 cars, or indeed, by the way, 15 trucks that are now platooning, or buses that are platooning. So this is one already feasible scenario. The question of whether a big event would be determined as such, we think occurrence versus risk event. I think that may well be a matter for discussion between insurers and reinsurers about what insurers ultimately, how they want to pay for it, how they want to structure it. You know, we know when you look at some of the workplace OHS stuff, some of the clauses actually disaggregate events for health and safety purposes and spread it laterally, because somebody must have come to a determination that that was a better way of handling those claims between the insurer and reinsurer. The other thing I'll just add very quickly is the potential, which is really exciting to me, is biomimicry. The potential for a range of vehicles to be hacked is likely to be mitigated in the first instance by what they'll have is, when one vehicle is hacked, it will instantly check with other vehicles of its similar kind and say, hey, I have a request to change my operating system here. Are you getting the same request? And if all of the other vehicles respond with no, it's just you, then it shuts it out. And this interconnectedness of systems will be a pretty good defence against somebody choosing to do a Jeep occurrence, for example, where they try to get one individual vehicle.
Thanks for all the questions coming through. We've almost got enough questions to go through the entire afternoon, but we'll just stick with the theme around autonomous vehicles. Governments are still struggling with developing policy frameworks around connected and autonomous vehicles. Should the insurance industry be encouraging government to set driver, operator, user qualifications or criteria for use of autonomous vehicles that may then affect validity of insurance coverage?
I'll give an extremely quick response. This is a big opportunity for the insurance industry to take thought leadership, establish a position, and quite simply make it easy for governments. They have an awful lot on their agenda. They do not have clear majorities through houses of parliaments. The insurance industry can come and say, here's a possible solution, make it easy.
I completely agree with that. In Australia, we have an uncomfortable history of setting up different systems and standards across states. Railway gauges are probably our favourite example. And the idea of driving your autonomous vehicle or being driven by your autonomous vehicle up to Tweed Heads and having to get the new operating system for Queensland will be slightly worrisome. So
that'll probably happen anyway at the border.
It may happen well. So part of the purpose of, for example, we are actively participating in the Australian Driverless Vehicles Association, whose objective is to accelerate the advance of autonomous vehicles into Australia, but to do so well. And it is an industry body with partnership from insurers, from car parking companies, from car manufacturers, from the Defence Department, a significant number of players. And a lot of our effort is to really get quickly onto the front foot with federal and state governments to help think through liability transfer. Is incredibly complex. There's already been a lot of discussion about the fact that parking infrastructure and road infrastructure sensors are going to have to take part of the liability. So there's a whole world of change. And the opportunity for us is to be in there so that it is actually the insurance industry as opposed to the endless other numbers of people interested in the combination of clever analytics and capital that could do insurance as an alternative.
George?
It is quite interesting being based in Singapore. I'll give you another perspective. We often see governments as actually stifling innovation, but if we look at Singapore government and the Monetary Authority of Singapore, they've actually created a regulatory sandbox. And what they mean by that is you can experiment with new products or capability to a test audience to see what potential regulatory issues can come out and see how they need to actually evolve regulation to cope with that. And they're also interested in creating Singapore as a global and regional innovation and R&D hub. So they've set up centres to facilitate innovation. There's a number of innovation labs that have been set up by insurers in Singapore. They've set up autonomous vehicle centres, and they're actually looking at bringing those together so that you can actually start exploring some of the issues that we've talked about.
Got to hand to the Singaporeans. They really have been incredibly innovative in the way that they thought about that whole innovation model.
Yep.
In total.
Andrew, and one thing I'd love to add into that, I don't know whether either of you were at the Intelligent Transport Systems Congress a couple of weeks ago in Melbourne, but Singapore did an extraordinary presentation. If there's one thing I took out of that, there were 11,700 something participants from 70 countries. intelligent autonomous vehicles is not edgy. It's kind of very mainstream. But there's something that I really took out of it. The conversation is very, very much less about autonomous vehicles and very much about intelligent transport, connected intelligent transport of every form, in which the car is a piece of the puzzle and potentially one that happens to be a little bit challenging in terms of a number of aspects of ownership and density and emissions. But more framing it in terms of how does insurance play a front and centre role as a financial engineer of intelligent transport? That's the question I think we really need to ask ourselves as an industry.
Here's a quick question to throw into the mix. What is a practical time frame for strategic thinking? How far ahead should we be trying to look, taking into account the need to develop plans and implement them and so forth, and given very, very short lead times and frames? What's a strategic planning framework, time frame, like in 2016?
So I get asked this question probably every week.
Yep.
Usually it's a question somewhere on the lines of, all right, but that stuff's kind of out there. What's actually going to happen, within the strategic planning cycle, which is 3 years, 1 to 3 years? I have a response which is around, mainly around my ongoing attempt to build capability and mindset, in fact, which is it's not the timelines that matter, it's the impact. So relevance matters much more. Possibility and relevance matters a hell of a lot more than the time frame for strategic thinking. As far as I'm concerned, strategy is about projecting yourself forward. A lot can change forward in a year, and a lot can change in 10. Really being able to understand what is relevant and what's possible, and how you include that into your decision-making frame of reference, that's what matters more. I think the real challenge is less about time scale and more about timing. It's the timing of when you decide to get out of being in big data analytics and pulling in customer information, calling it your own, analysing the hell out of it and making a margin out of it. When do you make a decision to shift your business model to an explicit, transparent, declared position that says, we recognise your information is yours and we will only do business with you when we are actively asking for permission in every single minute? Those kinds of decisions are incredibly difficult, and they ultimately come down to the really complex balance between stewardship and entrepreneurship, and that judgment call in how do you get that balance right.
George, Scott, do you want to add anything to that? All right.
It is challenging, and I think we've undertaken a strategic review of the business, just in Asia Pacific, to look at, do we have relevant skill set? The basic question is, do we have the right people to do the job as the industry is evolving and the pace at which it's evolving? So I would say we're still in discovery phase in investigating that. We've recognised that we do need to supplement some of the skills that we do have. We are lacking in some skill areas to cope with some of the change that's taking place in the industry. Cyber was an example I mentioned earlier, and it's good to see that we're starting to adopt more of a, fast fail is a terminology that's commonly used, but I think Kirsten alluded to an alternative form of learning rather than classifying as a failure. And so we don't really have a time frame on it again. We're still in discovery, but at least something's happening. And that's the most positive thing is we've undertaken a process and we're getting moving with it.
So we've just got a couple of minutes remaining. Is there anybody that wanted to ask a question in person? Thanks for all of the email questions. So I'm just going to finish with one final one from Tim Grafton, because it's a good question and it's an appropriate one. Are we doing enough as an industry to look at future employment skills, given the need to understand emerging risks and the velocity of change? So it touches on some of that issue that we talked about earlier, but just from an industry perspective, maybe each of you might want to comment briefly on that to wrap us up.
Okay. So a favourite quote of mine is, "The Americans fight the last war they lost," which means they take the lessons and they skill up for that next one that looks exactly like the last. So a question for us is, when we think about the skills we need going forward, what context, what perspective are we using in framing up those skill requirements? Data, analytics, ... Very much it's going to look like this world. I have a personal belief of, when you're sitting at the table, invite a poet. They won't know what you're talking about. They won't know the history of the deal the policy, the product. But if you're lucky, they will most likely ask you, why do you do that? Why does a customer come to us? And if you can't answer those questions, then you're probably going to keep careering down the path exactly the way you are. So those are the skills, those out-of-the-box skills.
I'll back that. I'm actually about to take a plane tomorrow morning to Melbourne to work with a group of school kids at a conference in Melbourne, because we have been doing a lot of the work we've done with help of high school students, because they have ways of challenging pretty much everything we see, but they also have very, very intriguing ways of thinking about what choices they want us to make and why. And that makes everybody feel extremely uncomfortable. So I think, I was thinking back on the presentations through the course of this day and thinking about, that problem of the protection gap. The insurance industry is responsible for supercomputers. We commissioned IBM to make supercomputers. So there's this interesting relationship between insurance as actually a quietly very innovative industry, and one that sort of shrouds itself in a mask of conservatism. There's a wonderful site out there in the world called Insurance is Sexy, run by an agent in a northern hemisphere. I think there's something around really challenging ourselves to speak to our core reason for being, which is the human experience of time, uncertainty, and the construct of risk. That's a very sexy thing to play with. If we start to recruit, and you talk to high school students about that, they find that genuinely interesting. It's a totally different recruiting proposition to come and play around with a few outmoded 60-page PDSs and see if we can convince some people not to read it.
It's a really good point. There's a lot of businesses getting into that whole idea of let's get a bunch of high school students into a room and throw the problem at them and see what they come back with. And really sort of natural disruptive thinking and out-of-the-box thinking. And I think it's just that whole sort of digital immersion world that they have that they can bring, quite a different perspective to that challenge. So I'll be interested to hear how the exercise goes. George, some final thoughts from you?
I think you touched on a point around brand, and that insurance as a word, as a brand, also needs to evolve, and that's probably one of the bigger challenges. And I think as we broaden the skill set, but also the ecosystem and the people that we're playing with, the startups, the disruptors, I think it will help morph the brand to some extent over time, and hopefully we'll start getting that increased supply into what may one day be deemed a sexy industry. It may not be 2050 though, it might be a bit longer than that.
I'd like to add something in there, which is just a bit of a plug for having moved from the Northern Hemisphere to working here. One of the things that I have discovered that's wonderful about Australian New Zealand insurance is that we repair. So we actually have got our hands into some of the most interesting industries out there on supply chain, materials, biotech, nanotech. We're putting our hands into the material structures of the world. And that's a cool thing.
Good point. Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you to thank our panellists, George Attard, Kirsten Dunlop, and Scott Reeves. Thank you very much.